Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. I hope you're all doing well. In this video, I want to continue with our journey with the Quran. And I want to spend some time with you looking at the third Caliph, Uthman, and his Mushaf and his particular effort to gather the Quran, or gather the different dialects of the Quran rather. Now, during the reign of Uthman, and he was selected, by the way, through a popular pledge, which is called a bay'ah, as we know, as a third Khalif, as a Sunnism holds, or Sunnis hold to be the way that it happened. Now, Muslims were engaging during his period in jihad, and they'd already reached, in a very short period, Azerbaijan and Armenia in the north. So they'd already reached from the lands of Arabia to Central Asia, which is quite a distance, especially in such a short period of time. Now, as the Islamic Empire was expanding at an ever increasing and rapid rate, these people who were fighting for the Muslims and people who were becoming Muslims, in particular, rather, the people who were already Muslims and who had left the Arabian Peninsula and made their way to these lands, they'd obviously had come from different tribes and provinces, and they had their own dialects. Just like in England, we have different dialects of English, right? So they had different dialects. And during the time of the Prophet, due to dharura, out of necessity, he taught them to read the Quran or recite the Quran, these tribes, according to their own dialect, just to facilitate for them and to make it easy for them. And as you can see, as you can appreciate, we are, after all, creatures of habit. People had then continued to recite the Quran in their own dialect. Now, I emphasize the word dialect because it's not the Quran itself that was different. The Quran was essentially the same, but its dialect was different. Maybe in some future video, I'll go through some examples of different dialects of the Quran that would have existed at the time of the Prophet and early Islam. But what I want to do for now is just focus on Uthman and his particular effort to bring this together. Now, as I mentioned, people are creatures of habits. It would have been very difficult for these Muslims who'd learnt the Quran in their particular dialect and now were engaging in war on the frontiers of Islam to leave their native dialect of how they'd learnt the Quran. And so there were different pronunciations, and as a result, what you begin to see is a sense of differences amongst the Muslims. You know, one saying, for example, that my pronunciation is more accurate than yours. Not as I stress again, the actual Quran itself. So you have the example in terms of disputes, in terms of recitation. Huzaifa ibn Yaman, a very famous companion, he comes to Uthman directly from the frontier, from Azerbaijan and Armenia, and he's actually achieved something before this, where he's brought the forces from Iraq with others from Syria together, and these armies have come together from Iraq, from Syria, Muslims who'd learnt the Quran in different dialects together. They've become a united force. And what he noticed was that when Muslims were coming together from different regions, there was differences in the pronunciation of the Quran, and this caused some friction amongst the Muslim community. So he went to Uthman and he said, "O Khalif, take this ummah in hand before they differ about their book, just like the Christians and the Jews had done as well." And it's very important. The Muslims were very wary of the history of Christianity and Judaism and the mistakes and the errors that they'd fallen into. So they didn't want to make the same mistakes that they had done. And these disagreements, by the way, were nothing new in the time of Uthman. Even Umar, who we talked about in the last video, he anticipated that this was going to happen, right? Having sent Ibn Mas'ud to Iraq, and he discovered, for example, that he was teaching in the dialect of Huzayl, as Ibn Masud had originally learnt it, Umar actually rebuked him. This is one of the dialects. This particular dialect of Hudayl was one of the dialects that was prevalent amongst the major tribes in the Arabian Peninsula, and this has all been written, so it's nothing new, and you can read around this in your own time if you want to. You can get in touch with me, and I can pass resources to you to read on this. So Umar, in fact, rebuked Ibn Mas'ud even in his time. He said, the Quran was revealed in the dialect of the Quraysh, so teach according to the dialect of Quraysh and not that of Hudayl. Ibn Hajar, much later on, who's a famous commentator on one of the most authentic books of hadith, the Bukhari, Sahih al-Bukhari, he actually makes a comment in this regard. He says, and it's actually a very astute observation, he says that for a non-Arab Muslim who desires to read the Quran, the most propitious choice is to read the Quran according to the Qurayshi dialect. This is best for him because this is the way the Quran was revealed to the Prophet, who was from the Quraysh, and they are, in fact, all the other dialects are quite difficult in themselves anyway. They are equal in difficulty. So the best one would be to read the one in which the Quran was revealed in, and you'll find this in Ibn Hajar's book Fathul Bari, this discussion as well. So let's go back to Huzaifa ibn Yaman. He warns the Khalif Uthman in the 25th year of Hijrah, and so that very year Uthman resolves to end this dispute, and what he does is he assembles the Muslims. He explains the problem, that there are these various dialects, right, very important, and he seeks their opinion on the recitation in different dialects, right? And it's really important he did this because this is a sense of political astuteness on his behalf, because people were at the time reciting Quran according to their dialect, and he wanted to give them an opportunity to air their views, right? Because people would have felt that their own version is more superior to somebody else, right? So when he did this, for example, we know Ali ibn Abi Talib radiyallahu anhu, he said, نرى أن نجمع الناس على مصحف واحد فلا تكون فرقة ولا يكون اختلافا قلنا فنعم ما رأيت. That I see that we bring the people on a single mushaf. We bring people to a single dialect, right? So there's no division or there's no discord. And everybody said, we all agreed to this. So the Muslim community was consulted, and they all agreed that we should bring the Quran to one dialect, right? The Quran was the same essentially, but the dialect was different. And when you look at his task of how he underwent, in how he went about completing this task, you'll see there's two ways or two narrations in terms of how he proceeded with this. The first one, which is probably the most famous one, which is one that most people have heard about, is that he made copies relying exclusively on the suhuf, on the manuscript kept in Hafsa's custody. Hafsa was, of course, the widow of the Prophet, peace be upon him. So that's the most common way, that he basically managed, he sought permission from her, she gave him permission, he had the copy, and he made copies of the one that was in Hafsa's custody. And we've talked about how this was retained by Hafsa. And remember, I've said this before, and it's true today, that Muslims, Islamic civilization places a great emphasis on memorization, on the oral tradition and the oral tradition, O-R-A-L and A-U-R-A-L, right? This was a tradition that emphasized people learned by just teaching one another, and they learned through memory and by listening, speaking and listening. It wasn't a tradition, it wasn't a community which was primarily based on text, right? Nowadays, Muslims are often seen when in madrasa tradition as a textual tradition, but early Islam was very much an oral tradition in of itself, right? So people had prodigious memories, and even today you'll meet young Muslims, boys and girls, adults as well, who have memorized the Quran, like I have. I've mentioned this before, but other texts as well. Okay, so let's go back to the story of the first approach, which was to get the copy of Hafsa. There's a lesser known narration which is very, very interesting, and I want to go through that with you, which is that what he did, and I'll just tell you the summary of it before we go into it, was he created a committee of companions, and they collected independent mushafs away from the copy of Hafsa, never touched it, left it with her. And then once it was all collated and they'd done their own research, collected it all together, done their own work, they compared this with the Suhuf of Hafsa, and lo and behold, they were both pretty much the same. There might have been some minor differences, but they weren't major differences. Another way to understand this would be like someone today who's already done some research. He's finished his PhD or he's finished his research, and he's put his project somewhere and locked it in a computer or in a room somewhere. And a second person comes along and he does research on the exact same topic or text, and then once he's finished, he compares it with the first one, and they are almost or entirely identical, right? Done independently. So this is another way that Uthman went about collecting these Mushaf. So let's talk about the first method, the first one, which is the directly from the Suhuf of Hafsa. Now we have Al-Barra, who narrates that Uthman sent Hafsa a message, basically saying that send us the Suhuf so that we may make perfect copies and then return the Suhuf back to you. So Hafsa sent it back to Uthman, and then Uthman ordered Zayd ibn Thabit, Abdullah ibn Zubayr, Sa'id ibn al-As, and Abu Rahman ibn Harith ibn Hisham to make duplicate copies. And three of them, he told three Qurayshi men that if you disagree with something with regards to the Quran, write it in the dialect of the Quraysh. You're just writing the dialect, stick with the dialect of the Quraysh, because the Quran was revealed in their tongue, right? And then they done this, they made several copies, and then they returned the original one, which I've talked about in the previous video, back to Hafsa, the widow of the Prophet. That is the most well-known method, or the famous method. But there was more. The second method was also an interesting one, and the second one is where Uthman essentially makes an independent copy of the Mushaf. So he appoints a committee of 12 people who are to oversee the task. It's a bit more complex, but I'll go through it with you. Ibn Sirin, who died in 110 Hijri, reports this himself. And Muhammad ibn Sirin and Uthman جمع 12 رجلا من قريش والأنصار فيهم أبي بن كعب وزيد بن ثابت في جمع القرآن. That Uthman decided to collect the Quran, and he assembled a committee of 12 from the Quraysh and the Ansar, and among them were people like Ubay ibn Ka'b, Zayd ibn Thabit. And then you have other sources where scholars sort of piece together the other 10 people, if you like, as well. So you have Sa'id bin Sa'id bin As for proofreading. Then you have Nafi' bin Zurayh bin Amr bin Nawfal. Then you have Zayd bin Thabit, Ubay ibn Ka'b, Abdullah ibn Zubayr, we've mentioned them already. You have Abu Rahman ibn Hisham. You had Kathir bin Aflah. And then in other books you find Anas ibn Malik, Abdullah bin Abbas, Malik bin Amir, and you have the last two are Abdullah bin Umar and Abdullah bin Amr ibn al-As. Right? So these are like the 12 that were given the duty of putting these various recitations, dialects of the Quran into one. And so there was an autonomous copy that was to be gathered independently from the Mushaf, the copy that Hafsa had. And when Uthman commissioned these people, the people who came to these 12 people and to Uthman had to prove that they had written this Quran, or the parchments that they had were written in the Prophet's presence. Ibn Asakir, a very important historian who died in 571 Hijri, he says that Uthman delivered a sermon, and in the sermon he basically said that the people have diverged in their recitations, and I am determined that whoever holds any verses dictated by the Prophet himself must bring them back to me, or bring them to me. So people brought their various verses written on parchment and bones and leaves, and anyone contributing to this collection was questioned by Uthman. Like, did you learn these verses? Did you take this dictation directly from the Prophet himself, right? And they were all made to answer under oath, and all the material was individually collected and handed to Zayd ibn Thabit. Okay, so thus an independent copy really emerges very, very early on in the Muslim community, and the 12 companions were setting aside all uncertainties in spelling and conventions so that Uthman might attend to these persons. So anything they weren't sure about, they left to one side. It was a very academic, very rigorous process. Remember, we're not talking about, just to emphasize again, we're not talking about the Quran itself. We're talking about a dialect of the Quran. Okay? And in fact, you'll find in the books, the classical books, ulama talking about the discussions that the 12 companions had amongst themselves around, the writing or the conventions of certain letters. So, for example, you'll have the verse in the Quran, at-tabut. Now, you can write a ta, the ta with a sort of an open T with 2 dots, or you can have a closed one with 2 dots on top. And so these were like just spelling conventions and so forth that they would discuss. So this independent project was going on with 12 companions, and Uthman was very much involved in collecting these dialects together. What Uthman also did was he retrieved a suhuf, a script, a manuscript that Aisha, the widow of the Prophet ﷺ as well, from her. And it's narrated in the books that Sawar bin Shabib reports that he, going in to see Ibn Zubayr in a small group, I asked him why Uthman had destroyed all the old copies of the Quran. So he replied that during Umar's reign, an excessively talkative man approached the Caliph and told him that the people were differing in their pronunciation of the Quran. It's pronunciation we're talking about. So Umar did resolve to collect all the copies of the Quran and standardize their pronunciation. But he suffered, as we know, that fatal stabbing before he could carry on the matter any further. So it was left to Uthman. The same man actually came to Uthman and raised this issue. And so it was Uthman who was really essentially completing what Umar had intended to do as well. So he says himself, the narrator of the story, that he sent me to Aisha, the Prophet's widow, to retrieve the parchments upon which the Prophet had dictated the Quran in its entirety. She had a copy as well. So there was an independently prepared Mushaf, which was then checked against these parchments. And after any sort of errors or anything that needed to be done, he ordered that all the other copies of the Quran be destroyed. Right? There's actually some useful details in this narration regarding the acquisition of parchments from Aisha's custody. Now, I must be academically honest here. This particular narration of this person coming to Umar and then Uthman and going to Aisha, the scholars of Hadith would probably find problems with this narration. It's considered weak. But then you find other narrations which give strength to it. And this is like when you have to sort of study a little bit of Hadith sciences. But I'm not going to go into that. So there's another one. Ibn Shabba narrates on authority of Harun ibn Umar, who relates that when Uthman wanted to make an official copy, he asked Aisha to send him the parchments which were dictated by a prophet and which she kept in her house. Right? And then Zayd bin Thabit was ordered to correct them accordingly. And because he was not always free, because he had other duties as well, there were other people working with the project on this as well. Okay, so you also find other places. Ibn Ushta, who died in 360, he reports in Al-Masahif that Uthman, resolving to have an autonomous copy of using primary sources, sent to Aisha's house for the Suhuf. Right. So in this account, a few differences were found, with Uthman's copy being corrected as necessary. Now, if we gather these narratives together, what it basically gives us is Uthman presented an independent copy relying entirely on primary sources, which included the companions' parchments, right, which they had to verify, along with additional material which was being held by Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha, anha, and you'll find this in this discussion as well in many books, primary sources as well. So that was something to bear in mind. So this independent copy was then, so you have this independent copy of the companions in their own dialects. Then you have the copy of Aisha, the widow of the Prophet. What they then did was they asked for a copy of Hafsa, which was the official copy that the Muslims had, and they brought that out as well. So you had these two copies, both independent of each other. Remember, we're talking about dialect, we're talking about pronunciation of the Quran. We're not talking about the Quran, the text itself. Okay, so that's important to bear in mind. But you can see the rigorous method that the companions, and Uthman in particular, were adopting. And there was little or no difference between these two independent copies. Now you might be wondering, why did Uthman go through the trouble of compiling an autonomous copy when the end product was to be compared with the Suhuf anyway, right? Why did he do this? One reason is it's a symbolic one, right? A decade earlier, thousands of companions were engaged in battles against apostasy in Yamama and elsewhere, and they weren't able to engage in the original Suhuf, right? The one we talked about in previous videos. And so Uthman, being very intelligent, wanted to draw from a larger pool of written materials, right? And so what he did was essentially he provided the surviving companions with an opportunity to partake of this momentous endeavor. And this is where you see how the companions understood from the Prophet that Islam is about everybody, right? It's about including everybody, male and female, in any grand project, right? It's not about trying to become a hero on your own, but actually working together, the togetherness of our faith. Now, there was no inconsistency between the Suhuf and the independent one, the one of Hafsa and the one of Uthman that was gathered. And so we get two broad conclusions. The Quranic text was thoroughly stable from the earliest days, right? Not as some people allege, and this has been rebutted now, but they say, oh, it was volatile until the 1st century, right? No, we know straight away that these independent copies that were with the Muslims were exactly the same when they were gathered together as the one as Hafsa had. And we know that now. There's a lot of research taking place, and we're finding copies that are pretty much the same, right? And the Quran is pretty much consistent. So this is pretty much accepted even within the academic community. Second thing, the second conclusion we have is the methods involved in this compilation were meticulous, right? During Hafsa and the time of Umar and during the time of Uthman, were meticulous and entirely accurate. These people were very pious people. They were very intelligent people, and they would have no interest in any way of trying to, God forbid, play with God's revelation. And this is something that's unique in Islamic, in world history, right? That we have the Quran as it was revealed in the 7th century to the Prophet, which as people living as Muslims, or even people reading the Quran as non-Muslims, when they read the Arabic, it's literally the Quran that was revealed to the Prophet, right? It's the same Quran, and millions upon millions of Muslims all around the world read the same Quran. They might recite it slightly differently, but the text is actually the same. So if I go to Africa or North America or Central Asia or to the Far East or wherever I go, if I go to a mosque, not that I need to go to a mosque to read the Quran, because of course I have the Quran, I've memorized the Quran, but if I was to pick up the Quran, it would be exactly the same, right? Maybe the design's different, but the Quran is the same. And that's very much what's something very special about Islamic history. And this is obviously because other religious communities tampered with their texts, and we have discussions around the Bible and other texts as well in terms of their authenticity and how they were collated. But the Quran is pretty much very much locked. It's very much protected. And God Himself, Allah says Himself in the Quran, "Inna nahnu nazzalna dhikra wa inna lahu lahafidhun," that we reveal this reminder, the Quran, and we will safeguard it. Okay. So anyway, all of this was done, whether it was done from the copy of Hafsa or this independent autonomous copy. What Uthman then did was he read it to the companions, so it was verified, right? ثم قرأت على ثم قرأت على الصحابة. It was read to the companions in Uthman's presence, and when it was finally recited, the duplicates were distributed throughout the many provinces of the Islamic Empire, and he made it an injunction that people write down the Mushafs, and he wanted the companions to make duplicate copies of the Mushafs for their own personal use as well. Now, there's some discussion around how many he sent. Some say 4, some say 7, some say 8, and that's something that I'm not going to really go into in too much because it's not really what I want to talk about. But everybody was happy with Uthman's decision, and there wasn't real objection to what he did. And Ali ibn Talib actually confirms this unanimous approval. You'll find this in the Masahif of Abu Dawud. Ali radiallahu ta'ala says, فَوَاللَّهِ مَا فَعَلَ الَّذِي فَعَلَ فِي الْمَصَاحِفِ إِلَّا عَنْ مَلَ مِنَّا جَمِيعًا. He did what he did with these fragments in the presence of all of us. We were all there. And then what he does is, Uthman, he sends, like I said, the fragments, the copies, not the fragments, the copies to all these places in the Muslim world, for example. But he also, interestingly, sent Qari with them, so people who could recite the Quran in that dialect to teach the people in those communities as well. So they were all consistently reading the same one. So it wasn't just updated version of the dialect, but it was also someone who could read it to them. So this is very important as a form of pedagogy. In Islam, we don't just read the text, right? We have teachers who teach us how to read things. We have scholars, because ours is a tradition where it's not just textual, but it's also part. It's also part that we pass on knowledge through people, right? It's not just reading books and lots of books. It's actually being in a companionship of people. So, for example, Zayd bin Thabit was sent to Medina. Abdullah bin As-Sa'ib was sent to Mecca. Al-Mughira bin Sihab was sent to Syria. Amir bin Abdul Qais was sent to Basra, and Abu Abdul Rahman As-Sulami was sent to Kufa, right? So they were all sent to different places. Now, early copies of the script of Uthman's Mushaf, and you can find this on the internet, and I might even send links up to this in the video afterwards, were largely consonantal. So they dropped the vowels and there was no dots, right? And I'll send you an image of this. Nowadays, you have all of this. It makes it very easy to read. It was very simple. And so Uthman's main purpose was to eliminate any occasion for dispute in recitation, right? Sending this was really important. Like, he wanted to do this. So what he did was he made sure he did this. But he also made sure that he didn't just send the copies to everyone, but he sent scholars who could read it in that script to these places as well. So that's something to also reflect on as well. And he sent some instructions finally, that anything that was different from this project should be burnt, because it would, if they weren't to do that, they would engender further strife. Now, this is the most common narrative, that they were burnt. Some scholars say that they were actually torn. Some say the ink was erased. Some scholars actually say when people received their copies, they compared it and they just amended it. But the fact is that this became proliferated and everybody was reading in the same dialect as well. And his second injunction was not to recite against the script of the Mushaf. So he standardized it, right? And so there's been studies on the Mushaf of Uthman. You'll find lots of papers in academic circles. And sometimes polemicists, to try and attack the Quran, feel that this is a weak point. But actually, if you read the details, it's not. And people who are experts in Quranic studies will tell you that, these are not really, they're not really major issues. So the Quran is very, very much a central part of the Muslim community. Uthman did a great service to end strife by bringing the different dialects together, right? And not the Quran itself. The Quran was the same. As I said, the Muslim community had memorized the Quran. There were literally thousands, hundreds who'd memorized the Quran. And like today, you have millions of Muslims who've all memorized the Quran. And if someone was to change something in the Quran, I would hope that people like me, when we read the Quran, the text, we pick up those changes. So it's impossible for the Quran to be changed because it's mass transmitted, mutawatir as we say, it's mass transmitted. So I'm going to stop the video there. I hope that's been useful. It's been a slightly longer video than usual, and I look forward to hearing from you and speaking with you very, very soon. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.